Hello and welcome back to Infamous Indie. I, of course, am your host, That Dead Girl. And if it's your first time joining me, basically what I do here at Infamous Indie is I sit down with you all and I share with you a true crime story from my home state of Indiana. And today you are joining me in my living room. Kind of just felt I needed a change of scenery for today, and I'm kind of just hanging out here in the living room with my cats. So why not just go ahead and film today's video in here? I did just want to start off by saying thank you to all of you who tune in and watch these videos. I know I say this a lot, but it really means a lot to me, and thank you for always being patient with me because I'm a really sporadic content creator. I kind of just upload when I have free time, which I haven't had a lot of up until recently. So, thank you guys for being patient with me. In the new year, I hope to lock down a more set schedule for content so that you guys will be able to know ahead of time when things are going to drop. And if you're up to date with all things Infamous Indie, you know we've been really heavily talking about the Sylvia Likens story. And I actually am going to be finishing up editing on part 4 sometime today. And I will have that out for you guys later this week. With that being said, I did kind of want to take a little bit of a break from that story. And I kind of wanted to move on to something new. So today we will be talking about the case of Orville Lynn Majors. So, Orville Lynn Majors, also known as the Angel of Death. I actually came across this story kind of just by chance. So, I'd say it was probably about 7 or 8 months ago. I was actually researching that crazy fertility doctor scandal that was going on in Indiana at the time. And there's like 50 or 60 kids, and that one doctor is the father of like all of them. But anyhow, Netflix ended up doing a documentary about that case, so I decided kind of not to go that route. As I've said before, I kind of like to do stories and things like that I feel haven't had a lot of hype or a lot of people haven't heard before. So then I come across this headline, and basically the thing that stood out to me most is that it said the Angel of Death, and I'm like, oh, that seems interesting. And then it kind of led me down this whole rabbit hole of Orville Lynn Majors and the crimes he committed. So without further ado, grab yourself a drinky drink and a snacky snack, and let's get right down into it. Orville Lynn Majors was born in Lytton, Indiana on April 24th, 1961. And if you aren't familiar with Lytton, it's a small town that's, I think, just south of Terre Haute, and it's kind of close to the Illinois border. And not a whole lot is known about Orville's childhood, other than the fact that his father was a coal miner. It's also said that he was inspired to become a nurse because as a young teenager, he had actually played a huge role in caring for his sick grandmother. Orville, or Lynn, as he was known to, his family and friends, was described as being a great big teddy bear. It said that he was a very likable guy and that he kind of always went out of his way to make people laugh, to help them, or to make them feel better. Orville also had an affinity for animals, and actually, as an adult, he owned his own pet store. While doing my research, I actually came across a pretty interesting story about Orville's time owning the pet store. So he was talking to a friend inside the store, and as they're talking or whatever, this fish kind of flopped out of one of the fish tanks and hit the floor. So the fish is flopping around and everything, and basically the guy says that he saw Orville pick up the fish and basically resuscitate it by blowing air into its mouth. So I think it's safe to say that for most people who knew Orville Lynn Majors, they all thought that he was a very caring and empathetic guy. In 1989, Orville would go on to graduate from the Nashville Memorial Practical Nursing School. So he had been living in Nashville during his time at school, and after he graduated, he actually decided to move back to Indiana. After graduation, he began working at Vermilion County Hospital, and this was in Clinton, Indiana, I believe, and this was about 50 miles north of his hometown. He would go on to work at the Vermilion County Hospital until around 1991, and then for whatever reason, he decided to take a new job in Tennessee. But in 1993, he would actually end up returning to work at the Vermilion County Hospital. Early on during his time at VCH, he received many glowing work evaluations. Orville Lynn Majors would actually go on to become one of the most popular and most well liked nurses in the entire facility. Everyone who worked with Orville or encountered him at work, could just see the amount of compassion that he had for his patients. People just really noticed how caring Orville was, like I said, and that he always went out of his way to make his patients feel special, and he just genuinely seemed concerned, for their well being. So everyone at this time, really just seemed to love Orville Lynn Majors. But strangely enough, all these unexplained deaths began to occur at Vermilion County Hospital. Now, normally, an average of about 26 patients died annually at VCH. I do believe I mentioned that this facility only had about 56 beds, and they also had like a 4-bed intensive care unit. So, not like a super huge hospital by any means. So, suddenly, the death rate within this hospital began to skyrocket to more than 100 people a year, just seemingly out of nowhere. To kind of put that into perspective for you, basically 1 out of every 3 patients that were admitted to VCH at this time were dying. And this was nearly 4 times more deaths than the previous year. So this definitely had many people wondering, what really could have changed that much within the last year to kind of cause this skyrocketing death rate. And you guessed it, this is kind of when people began to become suspicious of Orville Lynn Majors. Because oddly enough, all of these deaths just so happened to occur during Orville Lynn Majors' shifts. And it didn't take very long, actually, for Orville's coworkers to realize or to catch on that when Orville was at work, people died. And actually, some of the nurses that worked the night shift with Orville kind of began jokingly referring to him as the angel of death. It was kind of a running joke amongst coworkers, and some even began taking bets, kind of trying to predict which patients would die during Orville's next shift. So, as I mentioned, Orville Lynn Majors worked at this hospital for a time in 1991 before moving on and taking a separate position in Tennessee. So, upon his return to this hospital in Vermilion County in 1993, a lot of people did begin to notice a lot of personality changes in Orville. Now, it's said during this time that Orville had actually become very irritable and he was easily offended, I guess. One coworker even claimed to have seen Orville Lynn Majors injecting methamphetamines during one of his shifts. He would later go on to recall that actually Orville Lynn Majors always had a bag of fresh syringes with him at all times. Maybe it was the drugs, maybe it was just the stress of the job itself, but the once caring and compassionate Orville was gone. Now he just seemed to come off as very cold and callous. He even began, referring to some of the families in his care as dirt or white trash. And allegedly, he actually began to have just like a huge distaste for working and caring for the elderly. And apparently, he was very vocal about this, even going as far as to say that they should all be gassed and put out of their misery. So, with Orville's increasingly weird and aggressive behavior, and just the things that he was saying, and then all of these deaths occurring mysteriously during his shifts, all these rumors began to swirl. And even though most of these patients who were dying were elderly, it definitely raised people's suspicions. See, what was most interesting about all of these deaths is that the majority of them had passed away after having an erratic heartbeat and then going into respiratory arrest. Some of these patients were even dying from conditions that they didn't have when they were admitted. Or, they would mysteriously take a turn for the worst, even though they had been fine, for the most part when they arrived. So the plot thickens, and meanwhile, more and more patients are coding at an alarming rate. And for those of you who don't know or aren't familiar, coding basically means that the patient has gone into cardiac arrest. In spite of all these suspicious deaths and all these rumors surrounding Orville, he mostly went unnoticed during this time. But there was one person who just could not shake the feeling that something was really going on here. Flash forward to 1995. Nursing supervisor Dawn Styrek had actually become, very concerned about what was happening at the hospital. She actually kind of took it upon herself to start going through all of the time cards and comparing them to see who all was on duty during the times of these deaths. She would go on to discover that Orville Lynn Majors was actually present for 130 of the 147 deaths that had occurred at VCH. So, as you can imagine, this is probably all very alarming for her. So, she immediately contacts, hospital officials, and in turn, they contact Indiana State Police. Orville Lynn Majors was then suspended, pending the investigation. The Indiana State Nursing Board would go on to suspend Orville Lynn Majors' nursing license for 5 years. So basically, they determined that Orville Lynn Majors had exceeded his authority. He was basically giving out emergency drugs and working in the ICU without a doctor being present, which is a huge no-no. So obviously, once all of these things come out, Orville Lynn Majors is subsequently fired from VCH. Investigators would actually later determine that while Orville Lynn Majors was on duty, there would be one death that would occur at least every 23 hours. So basically, at least one person died every day, every time that this man was on duty. And this was a pattern, that held to be true whether Orville Lynn Majors worked day shifts, night shifts, week shifts, or weekend shifts. In fact, at one point, Orville Lynn Majors took a vacation and the death rate kind of plummeted to like one person within 23 days of him being gone. In fact, a patient at Vermilion County Hospital was 42 times more likely to die when Orville Lynn Majors was on duty. And that is just absolutely insane to me. So obviously, Orville Lynn Majors immediately hired a lawyer. He even set out on a small media tour to kind of proclaim his innocence. I believe he actually appeared on the Donahue show and the Montel Williams show, for those of us who are kind of old enough to remember the golden age of the talk show era. And at this point, prosecutors as well as the police were kind of stumped. Obviously the evidence was astounding, and from the very beginning, they believed that Orville Lynn Majors was responsible for these deaths. They just couldn't figure out how he was doing it. But not long after Orville set out on his little media tour to, kind of proclaim his innocence and whatnot, several of these victims' families started to come forward. And essentially, all these stories were kind of the same. Their family members would be admitted for one reason or another, and they would be in the care of Orville Lynn Majors. And all of a sudden, things would take a turn for the worst, and in most occasions, it would be after Orville had given them some sort of injection. And in a handful of these cases, these patients had actually died before Orville Lynn Majors had even had a chance to exit the room. So basically, you have this person, this nurse, who is supposed to be caring, for your loved one or your family member, and you are putting your full trust into this person to give your loved one the best care that they can possibly be given. And in all actuality, he's killing them. And not only is he killing them, he's killing them right in front of them. But with that being said, these investigators did start to notice kind of a pattern. Strangely enough, almost all of these patients' heart patterns began to widen around the times that Orville Lynn Majors was actually on duty. They then would call in an electrophysiologist to kind of analyze these EKGs to see if he could, find the cause of these widening heart patterns. So the specialist determined that there were actually only three causes or three reasons why um, these heart patterns would be widening like they were. So out of that, three scenarios would be a potassium overdose, a large clot in the lung, or a sudden heart attack. Hi, Jackie boy. In September of 1995, state officials actually began the task of exhuming 15 different bodies. All 15 of these patients were actually witnessed getting injections by Orville Lynn Majors, and they also all had those same widening heart patterns. And as it turns out, none of these victims had suffered a heart attack, none of them had clots in their lungs, or anything like that. So the big break in this case actually came when one of Orville's former roommates recalled seeing syringes and actually vials of potassium chloride and epinephrine in the apartment or home that he shared with Orville Lynn Majors. So with this information, police were actually able to obtain a search warrant, and they went in and searched Orville's home, and they actually found several of these vials, and all of them could actually be traced back to Vermilion County Hospital. So basically what Orville Lynn Majors was doing was injecting his patients with like this deadly cocktail of heart-stopping drugs. After a 2-year investigation, Orville Lynn Majors was arrested in December of 1997. He would go on to be charged with 7 counts of murder. Now, it's important to note that investigators did actually believe that Orville Lynn Majors was responsible for the deaths of 100 to 130 people. But because they felt that this amount of victims would actually overwhelm the jury, they decided to just stick him with the charge for the 7. And a total of 79 witnesses would go on to take the stand during this trial. So during the trial, it really came out about how much Orville Lynn Majors detested the elderly. Prosecutors basically concluded that Orville Lynn Majors chose to murder victims who were whiny, demanding, or just simply added to his workload. So really, it wasn't like he was being compassionate and maybe putting them out of their pain and misery. It wasn't like he was doing it for any real reason at all other than to just get rid of them because they were making his life or his job difficult. On October 17th, Orville Lynn Majors was convicted of 6 of the 7 murders that he had been charged with. The jury actually ended up deadlocking on the 7th victim simply because he had taken longer to die than the other victims, so they were quite unsure as to whether or not Orville Lynn Majors was responsible for the 7th victim's death. Orville Lynn Majors was sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 60 years. This was the maximum possible penalty under Indiana state law during that time. And more importantly, this would ensure that Orville Lynn Majors would surely die in prison as he should. The presiding judge, Ernest Yelton, would describe Orville's crimes as diabolical acts, in a parallel of evil at its most wicked. He concluded that the maximum sentence is the minimum sentence in this case. Vermilion County Hospital went on to be renamed, and of course, after Orville's trial and all of that, the hospital was eventually served with several wrongful death suits. Most of the families would settle their lawsuits and, they were compensated, but I'm guessing that no amount of money was going to bring their loved ones back. The hospital was actually fined about $80,000, and they would actually go on to lose their accreditation, causing them to shut down for quite some time. By 2009, VCH was taken over by Union Hospital. It underwent a rebranding, of renaming, and all of that, and is still open to this day. As for Orville Lynn Majors, it said that he went on to be a model prisoner. It said that he always maintained his innocence, and he basically chalked up all these deaths to just having bad luck, which to me, that's just stupid. You killed these people, you're a piece of shit. Just accept responsibility for that. Admit to your wrongdoings. I will just never understand that about, a certain serial killers or mass murderers. Like, we know what you've done, the evidence is there, so just cop to it. Orville Lynn Majors would actually go on to try to appeal his case in 2002, and the Indiana Supreme Court would go on to decide that the verdict would stand. Orville would go on to serve his sentence in Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, where he would go on to die of heart failure in September of 2017. And that is the story of Orville Lynn Majors, the Angel of Death. Thank you guys for tuning in. I definitely did want to cover this story simply because of the amount of victims and the fact that I'd never really heard of it before, which really surprised me, to be honest. 100 to 130 people, you would think that it would have gotten more media attention, I guess. I do feel as though the judge got it right in this scenario. Orville Lynn Majors was sentenced appropriately, and I do hope that the victims' families can find some type of closure and solace in that. One of the few times in most of the stories I've done that I actually feel like justice was served. Thank you for tuning in this week, and as always, if you like what I'm doing here at Infamous Indie, please do feel free to share my content. Be sure to like and subscribe to my channel for all of the latest episodes. I've definitely been working on a lot of new content as I've had a lot of free time more recently. I'm gonna get part 4 of the Sylvia Likens story up sometime this week. I'm also working on another story about a woman named Madge Oberholzer, and that's more of an older crime that occurred in Indiana history, so it will be very interesting to kind of talk with you guys about that. And I'm also working on another episode of Indie Unsolved. It's kind of where I focus on missing persons cases, and I will be covering the disappearance of Lauren Spearer. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, stay spooky, keep it creepy, and watch your back out there because it's a crazy fucking world.